Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Microscope podcast by Telescope Advisors, where we zoom in on the leaders, ideas, and technologies shaping the future of mortgage and housing finance. I'm your host, Julia Brown, founder of Telescope Advisors. On today's show, we go beyond the headlines to understand what's actually changing inside lenders, technology companies, and the people building the next era of this industry. Today's guest is a mentor of mine and someone who has spent decades at the intersection of mortgage, capital markets, technology, and leadership transformation. Joining us is Jim Deitch, CEO of Teraverde, one of the most respected advisory firms and investment firms in housing finance. Jim has long been known for helping lenders navigate complex transitions from regulatory shifts to technology modernization. Now he's helping lead another transformation, the application of artificial intelligence in mortgage. Jim and his team are exploring how AI can fundamentally change how lenders operate, make decisions, and serve their customers. He's also recently released a new book focused on the practical implications of AI for business leaders. Today, we're going to talk about what AI actually means for lenders beyond the hype, how tools in AI can help augment and not replace mortgage professionals, why the winners in this next cycle will combine data, judgment, and technology, and what leaders need to be doing right now to prepare their organizations for the AI era. Jim, welcome to the Microscope podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been thinking about how to approach this conversation because you are a thought leader in the space and have been such an incredible mentor to me and so many others in the industry. You've spent your career helping lenders navigate major industry transitions, regulation, capital markets, technology. And recently, you've really made yourself a credible resource as it relates to AI, too. So, what convinced you that AI was the next structural transformation for mortgage? Why did you decide to lean into the AI piece?
I think it comes to, that's a great question. It comes from lots of false starts. I think, and I'm going to date myself here, but back in 95 or 96, Leon Brenzel, who ran Freddie Mac, was looking for a couple of lenders to try this new product that they called Loan Prospector. And it was going to change the world. So I went down to Washington and met with the team, and we decided to pilot it. So we're one of three pilots in the Freddie Mac system. And it was described to have learning ability, and it would self-correct, and it would do all these wonderful things. And believe it or not, mortgage files would get down to just this thick and be done in an hour. So that was the first promise. And we implemented it. We used a collateral advisor. And what we found was files got thicker. They got more complex. And Loan Prospector, as good as it was, oftentimes raised more questions than not. So that's my first experience. And I will say I'm kind of a skeptic when it comes to say, will this really help? And then we went to bots, and we went to automation, and we went to all these other things over the last 25 years. And ultimately, they helped a little bit. But I think the promise of agentic AI in particular is larger and may fulfill that 30-year wait that I've been having to see if we can actually get this process a little faster and a little less paced.
Before we move on, let's talk about this for a moment because you gave the loan prospector example as to a promise made, not necessarily a promise kept, as far as speeding things up and reducing the paperwork or reducing the work needed in a file. Depending on when you started in the industry, there are likely a dozen or so technological advances that had the same consequence. I'm thinking of, I don't want to call any companies out to the carpet, but there are some that I'm thinking of where, I was leading
lots of guilty people out there. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was leading operations for a company, and we brought in a technology partner and said, this will replace underwriting. So you'll have, your DU or your LP, but you're not going to need an underwriter to touch the files. Your processor will just run it through this automated system. So we'll talk about automations. And then the processor will run it through the automated system. And from there, it'll go to closing, right? This is like the idea. But then the practical application became unless it's something complicated or outside the box, and then the processor would escalate a component of this to an underwriter. And then the underwriter gets it. And then there are now a lot of reasons for the underwriter to be back in the file. So we have the technology plus the underwriter, and the processor is slowed down because she's now got two masters, or he's got two masters as well. So when you were giving the example with LP, my mind went there to automation. And so I wonder, before we move forward, is that a normal result for all industries, or is that a mortgage specific outcome as we look to adopt new technology?
That's a great question. One of the things that I've always enjoyed doing is looking at parallel industries and how you get industries that have a high labor content, like mortgage banking, and what's the adoption rate and how long does it take to adopt? And there's really two industries that come to mind. One is the air transport industry, and the other is professional sports. Love to talk about both, but which would you like to start with?
Let's start with professional sports.
Well, professional sports is an interest that really human performance and whether or not the compensation for human performance is fairly set. And it's a question that a lot of people have thought about. It was really, I think, popularized with the Moneyball movie and Michael Lewis's book. But the ability to look at individual performance of people and measure those components is really pretty fascinating. Major League Baseball in particular has invested a lot of money in a system called StatCast that captures a very large data set, almost 7 terabytes in every game of video and other data. And it turns into structured data. And if any of the listeners are interested, you can go to statcast.com and look at the public facing version of this. So it really has been involved in coaching, evaluation of individual players, individual strategy. And I think it's a success story for Major League Baseball. The airline industry is another example. If you think about the number of things that have to happen right to have a successful airline flight, from the time the pilot taxis that aircraft away from the gate to the time it's taxied back at the completion. Every day there, in the case of Southwest Airlines, there's about 8,000 operations of landings and takeoffs day in and day out in all kinds of weather. And very, very, very high percentage of successful performance. And there, adoption is almost regulatorily required. So in MLB, the adoption is really up to the general manager, the coach, the players to all say, yeah, we're going to use this. And if somebody says, no, I'm not going to participate, then the chain breaks. On the airline business, all that automation and all that technology has been forced to be adopted because it's in the standard flight operating handbook. And when you see the reduction in accidents, the reduction of incidents, the on-time performance, although not great, it's a lot better than it used to be. All that comes from a standard set of automation, a standard set of technology. There's a fair amount of AI flying on the aircraft as well as on ground-based radar. And the safety systems within the U.S. air transportation system are just unbelievably good. So at scale, when you adopt these technologies, they do work. In mortgage banking, well, that's a different story.
But why is that the case? Why is it so tough to get adoption in mortgage banking?
I think you gave me a vignette that is so true. When you're looking at any of the automated systems for underwriting, you have a couple things that you run parallel processes and you almost do everything you did plus trying to use this automated element. And adoption just doesn't occur. People don't fully adopt the technology. Maybe it's not proven enough to adopt it. Maybe it hasn't been trained. Maybe it hasn't, all these maybe it hasn't been. But the end result is the files get thicker, the manual process continue, the costs continue to escalate, and the promise of much of the technology hasn't been delivered, I think, for 3 reasons.
Are those three reasons?
Thank you.
Well, let me tee this up.
See that up, yeah. I thought you'd give me them. So the first is that virtually all the technology that's been adopted by the industry tends to be segments of the process, not the overall process. The second reason is when you adopt a piece of technology, but don't really evaluate the overall business process. So are we doing what makes sense? And how can we take the overall business process? And before we start putting automated solutions. Let's think of how this actually works. And lastly, there's resistance to change in this industry. And the resistance is very, very high, from the sales team that wants to control the file to the processors that want to do it their way or use their technology, all the way through to the end. There's a lot of resistance to adoption of a standard platform, so to speak. And I think when you put all those together, it started in 96 in my experience with Lone Prospector, and it continues forward. I think there's a largely undelivered promise because we look at point solutions and try and fix one piece of it, or we try to figure a way to do this particular segment. We measure the wrong things, in my view, oftentimes. And as a result, a lot of money, a lot of churn, no adoption, no real lift so far.
Let's talk about the first component here and a end-to-end solution. The idea of an end-to-end solution versus a point of sale or a CRM or just a small sliver that can support advancing technology in mortgage. Why aren't there why isn't there a competitive market for vendors, technology partnering vendors to focus on the end-to-end front to back solution? Why do they zero in on just a piece?
That's a great question. I think it's going back to the genesis of the secondary market system, starting with the creation of FHA in 1933 and Fannie Mae in 1939 and Freddie Mac in the early 80s. That technology, that mindset, that we're basing the deal on docs, not data, is really fundamentally the underpinning of that. And it's largely, I think, an outgrowth of the agencies and the regulatory community trying to stick to that's the way it works and that's the way it is. If you think about consumer credit and particularly getting a credit card, so think of it. You and I can go on any website for any major credit card provider, American Express, Chase, Citi, anybody,
Hmm.
and say, I'd like a $50,000 or $25,000 unsecured credit card.
Hmm.
And it's a 30-second process. You consent and things happen behind the scenes in an automated way. And we had a firsthand seat to that at Teraverde when we worked with a very large credit card provider that wanted to change the 29 different ways of doing things into a simple solution. So we got a pretty good look at it. And what was amazing to me is that making 25 or $50,000 or more of unsecured credit can be done in seconds.
Yes.
And if you look at the back end process, it's a series of algorithms, credit polls, other data that exists that allows somebody to make an informed credit decision. And if you think about the amount at risk in a mortgage loan, where you either have MI or 20% down, you look at the statistics of what the typical foreclosed property costs a secondary market investor. Depending on the size and assuming it's a conventional average loan balance, it's $60 to $80,000. So we go through all this effort to prevent the foreclosure and potentially lose $60 to $80,000. But a credit card company is issuing that amount of risk unsecured all day long in seconds at a cost of under $100 to do a loan, to process a loan. So a lot of it is just legacy, trying to get either the regulatory community or the agencies to think about, let's use data, not documents. Let's thin things down and go from there. And it just hasn't happened. Um, and I don't know how you coalesce all the constituencies to get it to happen. But given that, there are some things that we could do, I think. And part of it is to look at the business process of how you get from A to B. And instead of simply trying to automate, well, today we have too many touches on the processor. We have too many resubmits from the underwriter. We have too much time spent in a file. There's too many things going back and forth. When I look at the data from lenders and I look at it through the lens of the way an airline, for instance, evaluates the performance of its people and its equipment, we are light years behind.
Hmm. Well, and I think part of what stands out to me in this is as we're talking about the tone at the top, for lack of a better phrase, the regulatory components, and the way that things are structured, it is outdated. Is there enough pain, or are there great enough incentives to restructure it today? And if not, what would it take?
Well, that's a great question. And there's really a couple dimensions. And the reason I just referred to the agencies and the regulatory community is according to the MBA, the compliance burden and the red tape burden on a typical loan is $2,000, $2,500. So that's kind of the basics to say if you had a perfect system that worked like a credit card, you'd still have $2,000 of compliance overhead that you're going to have to just spend because that's the way it is. And, uh, I had lunch with Jim Lockhart 2 years to the day after, and Jim was at the time FHFA commissioner, uh, 2 years to the day after they essentially put Freddie and Fannie into conservatorship. And I asked Jim, what do you think it will take to get them out of conservatorship? And his comment to me in so many words, I can't remember exactly what he said, but if I would have realized putting them into conservatorship would take over 2 years to even begin to think about getting out of it, I probably would have looked for another way.
Mm,
Well, it's going on 20 years. And we still don't have a way out. And it's almost become the de facto, well, this is the way it's going to be. Uh, and one never knows whether we'll ever have, a true emergence of the GSEs out of conservatorship, um, or whether there'll be an alternative. But the underlying issue is you start with that $2,500, you're still $10,000 of cost that you don't necessarily need. And 70 cents of that $10,000 or $12,000 of cost is people cost.
mhm.
There's no other industry I'm aware of other than healthcare and professional sports that has that type of labor content on it for a repetitive, particularly for something that's a repetitive process.
Right.
And it just astounds me how expensive the labor component is and how it doesn't scale up and it doesn't scale down well.
Well, and as to scale and what we are finding with the use of AI, where do you think AI is actually delivering real value for lenders today? Or what do you think it will be the area that AI is able to do?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think of this as what can you do that might be just productivity gain as the first area because that's not constrained by systems nor is it constrained by the GSEs or compliance. So, how well you get productivity out of what you're doing is what I would consider to be the low hanging fruit. So that's one, and we'll come back to that. The second one is how you really think about business process and are there ways you could do things differently based upon the first predicate, which is I think you can improve using data the efficacy of what you're doing. And then lastly, there are some end-to-end systems that are emerging, and I'm thinking of Vesta and Wilco and some of the other newer products that are emerging, as well as some of the things that Tidal Wave and others are doing with agentic AI that I think have some promise. So it's really low hanging fruit, business process re-engineering or rethinking, and then the end to end. And the end to end is going to take a long time because to use some of these things, you've got to abandon what you're doing. So it's really easier to do it on a smaller scale than it is to try and change a whole organization. So that's my thought process of the kind of walking up the stair step.
And you've referenced agentic AI twice so far. Not everyone tuning in would be familiar with that definition. So could you define for us what agentic AI is?
Well, from a layman's standpoint, think of it as a piece of technology, software, that can be taught to perform a series of tasks and to make those tasks learnable and to make those tasks having at least automation judgment in how they're done. And as it continues to work and the models continue to evolve, you're getting more and more of the judgmental elements built in.
Mm,
So it's not a chatbot. It's not a large language model per se. Think of it as a digital employee that does exactly what you ask it to do, given a relatively narrow latitude to go and perform.
So that's interesting because I was thinking as you started to say this, okay, it's doing tasks. So maybe it's similar to OCR, RPA automation. It's really not because the judgment component is putting it in a different category, right? We're not training it to do a singular task. We're training it to understand what all is required for a given set of tasks and under what circumstances and to make choices. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's a fair assessment. It's really not applying human judgment per se. It's applying judgment that it learns or can be described in the rule set or the prompts or the guidelines that you set for it to do. So one of our engineers had some time on their hand, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing, and said, can I just try something here? So they ingested the guidelines from the agencies, ingested the compliance guidelines and so forth. And he said, try this out. So I gave it a scenario and described two borrowers, their income, their background, their previous history, their credit history, all of those elements, and gave a very long scenario and said, qualify this particular borrower set. And I was shocked at how it was able to go through and apply at least the guidelines to it, maybe not the judgment per se. So the guidelines came out. And then I asked this particular agent to go through and please create me a 1008 underwriting summary. And I gave it the Fannie Guide reference of how a 1008 is done. And it came back with a 1008, it populated all the information. It was pretty close for a first attempt. And then I asked it to evaluate the creditworthiness and to give me the pluses and minuses, which it did. And it went through. And again, it referenced guidelines and some journal publications. And at the end of the day, I looked at it and said, I gave it a pretty clean file, but absent regulatory requirements and absent the things that would be around the guardrails, it did a very credible job of describing the pluses and minuses, the conditions. And if you would have run that through DU and then asked that agent to evaluate the DU findings and look at the data to confirm it, you probably could get that loan 99 out of 100 times ready to close. Question is, who would trust it and who would allow it, and how would the underwriters feel about it, or how would the originators feel about it? And I think that's the key test. The technology can do this if you let it.
What's interesting about this, there's a lot interesting about this, but where my mind is going as you're speaking is, I wonder as a next prompt, if you asked, is this a saleable loan? Let's just start with, is this a saleable loan? Fannie Freddie, right? And then from there, uh, you know, yes or no. Second question would be, what is the probability that this borrower would ever default on this loan, and see if there's a gap. And you run it on different scenarios, right? Like you ground it in data, but see, and that would potentially be a bit of an interesting thing to see back to our earlier conversation, whether or not we really think we are measuring all of the right and necessary things as we talk about creditworthiness for borrowers.
I did ask that particular agent to give me the analysis from a Fannie standpoint. And if you remember the old underwriting guide that Fannie had, probably in 2003 or 2004, it had a couple of graphics in. I don't think you were born then, so you may not know this.
Thank you.
But the guide was, well, there's two major factors of credit. It's the credit metric score, there's a credit score, and it's the skin in the game. And then there's 8 tertiary or secondary factors, which are length of employment and property use and so forth. And it literally came back and said, here's the two major things. The credit score on this borrower pair was, gave it a 720 to consider and a 710. And move it an 80% loan. So slam dunk, right? So then gave it a 620 and a 640 at 90 with MI. But it does understand that, which tells me that if you think about it, the guidelines are pretty linear. Going back to the loan prospector days, the architecture of that particular product when it was rolled out was really, what the Freddie people described to me as a vector-based kind of intelligence at the time. And it's not that hard, but it's all the other things that come in. So I don't know if you saw that Better's claiming that it can underwrite a file in 47 seconds, 57 seconds, or whatever it was, that made the news feed a couple of days ago. And someone said, I don't think that's possible. Is that actually possible that AI could do that? And the answer is, if you give it an absolutely good data set that has all of the relevant information, then the provenance of that data covered and verified, why, sure, you could do it in 47 seconds. But the reason you can't is we build loan files almost like you build a high rise. You do it one floor at a time, one issue at a time. And even my friends at ICE say, yeah, there's probably 15 to 20 versions of that loan as you go through. So think about it. The versions of that loan as we go through are constantly changing. And you put on the first layer and the second layer and the third layer and the fourth layer. And an underwriter asks, well, I need to understand this and this and this. And there's more data coming in, which may contradict some previous data. And you just keep going. And this process gets very, very complex to the point that the ICE folks that are putting together their standards performance team contemplates multiple versions of a loan. Multiple versions of a loan coming from documents and data. Well, that's 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 the issue, is the judgment required to really understand how you build that file, particularly on documents. Still takes a tremendous amount of time. And the judgment that goes into all of those documents and reconciling the version controls between what you started with and what you end with is where a large part of the labor is really being spent. So it's an issue I think will get resolved, but it starts to get resolved with business process of why do we build 17 or 18 versions of this loan as we assemble it? I don't know. You've been on the operations side. Why do we do that?
It doesn't, it's funny because the first thing that comes to mind is we do it because we uncover new information as we go, right? Why? Why does that have to be true? If our loan officers on the front end know what to ask for and are asking for things that build out the file, why is there new information that comes into play that requires a new versioning so frequently? I think about, tax preparation. As a business owner, I'm thinking about, I give my accountant everything I think that they're going to need, and they come back to me and say, okay, this, and this. Based on those answers, then there's another set, another round, another series, another version. But that's a complicated case. Not every case is complicated. And the longer I do it, I think the more I know how to anticipate what it is that they would need, and they would learn exactly what to ask me about my scenario. And that's where I wonder also if there is an opportunity for AI to come in and maybe read between the lines a bit with these borrower profiles and become more prescriptive and really what would be needed. And also going back to the original question of, are we asking for more than we need to determine whether or not a borrower is going to repay the loan?
I think all those are great observations, Julia, and it really comes back to uh, the thesis we talked about earlier. It's the business process of how we do things.
Hmm.
In my early career as an originator, the person that taught me how to do things, I had two people. One was get the loan in and figure it out later, get it locked, get it in, get going on it. And the other person said, you really need to know how to structure, and you should think about what is necessary to structure this loan and get everything you need so it gets the underwriting and gets through and has no issues whatsoever. So I started that way and quickly learned that giving the complete file and structuring it costs me deals because the consumer just wants, just tell me what I need to do and I only have 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Yes.
So we almost have a bias to, just start to get it going and then figure it out as we go, which is what you mentioned about you keep learning new things as you go. So if you had, uh, and Blend, I think, did a pretty good job of this in its early inception of going through and trying to ask questions and anticipate and then make the conditional questions to uncover all the things that the borrower may have with the question set. But most of that was rules based, and rules based tends to get clunky at times. But could we have an agentic agent that would, I think of going to a doctor's office before you have a consult with a surgeon or a specialist, and you end up filling out all these forms, and then you have an intake person that asks you all these questions and reviews your history and your medical history. And by the time you get to see the specialist, they reviewed your file, they have a lot of the background information, a lot of the history there, and they make the most out of the 15 or 20 minutes they spend with you because they already have a good understanding of what your profile is. So there's probably something to be said there. A couple of people in the industry that I'm aware of are thinking about things like that. How do you do okay, I've had the application. Now, how do you take that complete history so that you get everything that you need up front and you uncover all those particular issues? Almost like a post appointment or post initial application workup to see is everything there. But the business process that we have, I mentioned that as kind of the first thing to do. We've loosed some agents on and agents that have learned a lot. We've loosed them or let them loose on some of our willing clients' data sets and the LOS and the POS and related systems. And we took a look and said, what's the percentage of data that is reliably there at the point where this loan is, whether it's a task workflow based or milestone based? What's the efficacy of the data when you look at it and run it against all the other points in the file? What do you think the percentage of it is at submit to underwrite the first time? What do you think the completeness and accuracy of the data is? Alden,
Incredibly low.
it's low. Yeah, it's low. And then when you get it from an approval, what do you think the accuracy and completeness of the data is?
6%.
It's actually a little worse than that because when you look at the conditions that come out, I've seen a loan file with 104 conditions in it, and you say the data's not very good, right? To come up with 104 conditions, it's just crazy. What do you do when you take loans that have already been shipped and funded and you run it through kind of the data integrity or that same data quality check? What do you think the number is on a pretty large sample of loans that have been submitted? What do you think the this can't be right percentage is on the basics, like FICO's not between 500 and 800 or 850, or LTD is not between 20 and, depending on the loan, 95, 97, DA 100, whatever. What do you think the data error rate on loans that have been submitted and funded happens to be in terms of percent? More or less than 1%?
More or less than 1%? I would say more than 1%.
More or less than 3%?
I would say more than 3% would be my
More,
instinct.
more or less than 5%?
I think more.
It depends on the lender, but some are more. So when you think about that and the representations you make to the agencies, which are absolute, right? Despite the, oh, we have a better framework, they really don't. You think about that rate, and you can go through a file and find any reason whatsoever to repurchase a loan or force a repurchase of a loan that has nothing to do with the actual cause of that potential delinquency or default. So if you're willing to have that level of error rate or critical data issues, it's not surprising that going through that whole process, it's got a lot less data integrity and data quality to begin with. So I was talking to Gary Kelly at Southwest Airlines when he was his CEO, and I asked him about, how accurate and how many mistakes do pilots make when flying the aircraft? And he goes, well, you can tell a major mistake, when you have an incident, meaning something got bent or broken, or forbid we have a crash. He said, but the rate is very, very, very low. I said, so how many processes occur when you actually, from start to finish, how many inputs happen? He says, Jim, it's thousands. I mean, there's thousands of things that happen. There's interactions with controllers. There's setting the power, the takeoff power and all the attributes of what the rotation when you lift the nose off and when you climb out and all those different things that occur. It's just the permutations of thousands of different things, but they all go right. If they don't go right, We have two pilots up front. One pilot's flying, one pilot's monitoring, so we catch it. We have systems that catch those things. We have collision avoidance technology that alerts if there's a potential conflict. We have all those things, and they work pretty well together. But in that case where you have the Swiss cheese, where all of a sudden the Swiss cheese holes all line up and something slips through, then you have an incident. But you don't have a lot of Swiss cheese that lines up that way very often. And he looked at me because we had talked about the error rates and the repurchase rates and the default rates and so forth. He says, "Do you realize if we ran our airline like you run the mortgage banking business, we'd be out of planes in 5 days?"
Fair point.
I said, "Yeah, that's a fair point." And I
Maybe we
thought,
need some airline execs in our industry.
well, I think the first thing is to really think about the business process and the quality of what's going in, because it's it's uniformly reasonably okay, but it goes back to that better brag about, oh, we can underwrite a file in 47 minutes or 47 seconds. Yeah, but it still takes you 20 days to get it ready to underwrite. So what's 47 seconds? I mean, it's a brag that makes no sense.
It is a sexy headline though, and I think that, there are a lot of companies with an interest in being the one to break the mold and, having that reputation. I wanna
Well,
ask I wanna ask about disruptive AI, the new book that you co-authored with, Maylene, your business partner, and, it's on AI and leadership, and I'm wondering if you can share a couple insights from the book that you believe mortgage executives listening in should understand as they think about AI and mortgage.
well, I first of all have to compliment Maylene because she did a great job as a co-author. It's the first time I've co-authored a book, and literally it went on the bestseller list on the second day. So not only was she a first-time author, she's a first-time bestseller, and
Excellent.
I've had the fortune of getting a bestseller, but it took more than 2 days. So I
Mhm.
think whatever Maylene's magic is, it worked. But I think the thing that we really took away is that agentic AI by itself is really not going to help very much, simply because you can't use an agent to do things in which the process is fundamentally not optimized. It will do it, but it will make it'll have the same limitations of if you have bad data to start with, there's nothing agentic AI can do to get better data. That has to start with the business process of how you begin to capture that data, and whether you direct source it or use documents, all those different things. It won't really help. What we found is, at least early on, there is a huge opportunity to look at business process and go through and say, if you let your business process essentially be managed without the types of guardrails and the types of insights that allow that business process to reduce the number of errors and to not do things that increase the likelihood of that loan falling out, it would be very helpful to do that. So one of the things that we found, and one of our actually multiple lenders asked us, is why do we have these loans sitting here? And you go through and look at what I would consider to be slam dunk loans. They're, no rate, they're rate and term refis under 75, great credit scores, low DTI, not complex. The income's easily documented, lots of liquid reserves, lots of net worth, and it takes 20 days to get it to an approval, a final approval. So we looked into that, and the reason was people are spending all their time on these really difficult files and the rushes and all the other things. The extent that you have a loan that you could look at, likely get it approved and closed in 20 days, let alone just getting around to it. And they sit because there's not a methodology to say, this loan's ready to go, underwrite it and close it. It's a rate and term refi. Save the hedge costs, save this, reduce the chance of fallout. And and the reactions in times are, we never knew that happened. Well, you can't see it when you're looking at just, reports that say how many in, how many out. There's a lot of nuance in the data that really comes through. I mean, fallout rates, and the reasons for fallout are really very lender specific. I asked one CEO at a very large lender, what were her pull-through rates on the loan officer side? And she said, well, our average is like 68. Okay. Are you happy with that? Yeah, it's pretty good given our business. They said, so 1 out of 3 loans falls out. What's that cost? Well, it costs credit and you have this and that's what's the cost of reputation? Because these are withdrawals, not denies. These are withdrawals. What's it mean that 1 out of 3 customers says we don't want to finish with you that? Then we went through and said that 68% really was comprised of some loan officers who were getting 30s, 3 handles, 30, 35% pull through. Some were getting 90. So my question is, if you're selling the same product and you're going through the same underwriting system and the same technology system, and one individual has 35% and one has 90, why is that? And is it, what are the attributes of that? And it was a really interesting question. We had a long discussion on it, and ultimately that particular lender began to measure things. But I'll tell you one thing we did find out is agentic AI can tell you which loans are going to fall out and why before they
Interesting.
fall out. Before they fall out.
Is this like a stopgap? Is this an opportunity to prevent it? Or is this a reason not to get into it at all? Or how do you use that data once you've got
That's a
it?
great question. So it's really 2 things. The one is declines are going to be usually based on credit and loan type. So you can't, if it's going to be declined, it's going to be declined. There is a nuance to say if you have a loan that's likely to be declined on an FHA loan, are you doing the borrower a favor by declining it, or do you have a consultation to say maybe you want to think about credit counseling and think about some things you do, because once you get a decline, that kind of lives with you, right? But it's the withdrawals that get fascinating. And when you look at the withdrawal rates and the likelihood of withdrawal, there are really just 5 or 6 predictive factors that say that loan's going to withdraw. Some of them are obvious, that if you have a loan that's locked at 6 and today's rate's 5, well, you're going to have to take some action on that and reprice it. You look at withdrawal rates, we also look at fail to close on time rates. So when you look at it doesn't close on time, that's one form of an exception. Or it doesn't close at all is another form. But all of them cost you money because you're hedging them, and you talk to the hedging teams and they say, well, yeah, we'd expect a certain amount of fallout. So, well, that's like Gary Kelly at Southwest saying we expect a certain number of crashes.
Yeah.
We don't.
Right.
We say, how do we anticipate things going wrong to prevent the crash? And that's where I think you got some real opportunities with agentic AI. For instance, credit and loan characteristics are highly predictive. Time and motion, how long that loan is in process and where it is and what was the last milestone that it took through or the last task segment it took through. When you see gaps of loans that stall and they're not moving, that's a very, very predictive element that loan is likely not going to close on time or at all. The second is, the second most prominent thing is some originators and AEs are very prone to fallout. We call them fallout. So if you took those things, the market rate, the fallout proneness of the AE or the originator, the fallout proneness of the particular people touching that file, the loan characteristics and time and motion, and a few other aspects. And you put them on a scale that said we're going to look at, well, is it 1, meaning very low probability of fallout, or 6 being high probability of fallout? And you simply move that matrix around and you go, you have loans here that are all 5s and 6s. What if you picked up and looked at that loan and said, here's a likely reason it's going to fall out. Can you interdict it and prevent it? And the answer is yes. And if you could interdict it and prevent it in the tune of reducing your withdrawal rate by 2 or 3 points, what does that do to profitability? Well, we've modeled it, and it's 13 to 15 basis points of pre-tax, believe it or not.
That's more than I was anticipating.
It's a big number. So those insights are I think, really available on Agenics. And the other is, and we've done this pretty deeply, we've looked at who's making money for you at individual level and who isn't. And the Pareto principles enforce here. What it means is that in typical lenders, the curve looks like this. 20% of your people produce 50% of your output, whether it's contribution margin or productivity or whatever. The next 30% produce 30%, and the last 50% of the people produce 20%. So if you think about it, and then take that last 20% of the output, 25% of the people on the bottom end of that scale that's here produce 5% of the output. So you have a way of coaching. If you're really in that top 20%, coach it, retain them, help them, uh, admire them, do the things that cause people to want to stay. That middle 30 is coachable. That's where you really can move the needle because they're good, but they can be a lot better. The top half of that bottom tier could be coachable, and you might be able to move them up to the middle. And that bottom 20% or 25%, you really just say, look, to be here, you've got to do X and Y. And if you can't make that standard, this just isn't going to work out for us. But the persistence of not doing that coaching and not doing that data-driven analytic is why we have costs that are what they are. And I look at clients that have materially better costs and are making 100, 120, 150 basis points pre-tax year in and year out. They're the ones that when you look at that fallout proneness, you see ones and twos almost across the board because they have a process to manage that before it elevates to. So that's a long-winded answer to a simple question.
You know what? That's the best kind of answer because it's the most actionable and the most helpful for the listener. So thank you, Jim. And this has been a fascinating conversation. Clearly, your insights extend beyond AI, but I'm so thrilled that you have invested time and energy and thought into AI as it helps reshape how our mortgage companies operate across the industry, and whether it's decision-making, business process, customer experience, you're helping the industry move from theoretical to practical AI. For my listeners, if you'd like to learn more about Jim's work, you can check out the book. It is Disruptive AI, and it is available, I know, at least on Amazon, but I'm sure wherever books are sold, you can find it. Jim will be at the ICE Experience Conference in Las Vegas next week, the 16th through 19th. And again, thanks for listening. I'm your host, Julia Brown, founder of Microscope Advisors. And until next time.